So tell me more about this study that was done. This seems like this was a pretty big deal if they're using a single study to radically alter the labeling of a pharmaceutical that's used by presumably millions of men.
So it was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, so a very high-quality study. 5,246 men aged 45 to 80 who had a pre-existing or high risk of cardiovascular disease.
Oh, wow.
But who had low testosterone or hypogonadism and had two, so when you get the testosterone level checked, you always make sure you have it twice. So they were checked at least twice. And they had, documented below 300 twice with a symptom.
So they're talking about, it's a large group, and you're talking about men who already have high risk of cardiovascular problems.
Pre-existing or a high risk.
Wow. So they're kind of stacking the deck in order to make it as negative of a situation as possible.
Yes. Yeah. And they're really just trying to make sure that they're evaluating the population that would be most at risk for something like this to be an intervention to change,
that makes
to
sense.
Cause an issue. Yeah.
Okay. And they found functionally no difference between placebo and the control in the trial groups?
Yes. So the primary endpoint was the major adverse cardiovascular events. Again, they found that the TRT was non-inferior to placebo in that event. The rate of the events was similar, 7% in the treatment group, 7.3% in the placebo group.
Wow.
So that was the
rate of events being the percentage of people in each group who had a negative cardiovascular situation.
Yeah. And then they did point out some other adverse events that were, statistically significant, but not maybe, clinically meaningful enough to deserve a place in the labeling, more or less. AFib, 3.5% versus 2.4%. Acute kidney injury, 2.3% versus 1.5%. There was a little bit higher risk of pulmonary embolisms and also a slightly higher, so 3.5% versus 2.46% risk of clinical fractures. So that's just more or less worth mentioning. Again, not in relation to the primary endpoints, but worth noting some of the findings after the fact. There was a high discontinuation rate in the trial, which I did note, which was noted, and most of the individuals reached testosterone levels that would be considered modest or on the lower end of normal.
Okay.
So and then I don't know if we mentioned they used testosterone gel as the treatment route of delivery in this case. So it was interesting. There are certainly, glad Joey mentioned, there are definitely some other things to unpack from it. But again, this mainly set out to try and determine, is there really a link here to the major events that were seemingly occurring because of it?
Yeah. Like Dante said, I think it's key to remember, because when you look at things related to testosterone and downsides with it, I always kind of center it back to, well, what were they dosing to? And so that's critical. This is set up to dose to normal levels. And then it just, again, was looking at, all right, so you have low T, you do have a high risk or pre-existing cardiovascular disease. If we don't treat it at all, so that was interesting too. It wasn't a comparison of mild and moderate treatment or different levels. It was just, we're going to treat it to normal or we're not going to treat it at all. Is there any cardiovascular benefit to not treating it at all in this population? And there was not.
Yeah.
And there was not.
That's great news especially for this group of men that need this sort of treatment. But it's just great news in general that a naturally occurring hormone isn't going to cause all of us to die earlier.
Yeah. And I think it's too, because low testosterone is one of those conditions that's a quality of life thing.
Yeah.
It's not, if I'm not treating this condition, this is purely quality of life. And so I understand that it does make sense that the bar would be higher or lower, depending on how you want to say it, but that there would be, if there is any risk, because we're dealing with men that are aging, there's the highest risk. If there is any increased risk at all for a cardiovascular event, is the quality of life benefits worth it? And, so I think that is, very critical to me to understand. Again, as long as you're doing the right dosing, you're dosing to the right values. You're not hyperdosing. You're not dosing whenever you don't have low T. So again, this is again not meant to be a sign off of, I'm in my 30s and I've been feeling a little tired, and this doctor writes this. That's not what this is. That's what I make very clear, that this is this certain age dosed to the proper levels, normal testosterone levels, and done so only whenever you're diagnosed with low T.
We're not talking about supranatural testosterone levels.
But that ultimately, though, is what muddies a lot of the conversation around it. When people start to get, if you kind of lump yourself in, well, I hear when people do this testosterone, or they're just doing it because they want to be better in the gym or whatever the case may be, or look better. And again, those things do matter.
Yep.
Again, that's back to the quality of life. I think that's a whole discussion in and of itself. But in terms of this study, it's, we're sticking to the basics of who would be prescribed and who the label was on there for. But it does, again, back to showing you why the label was on there in the first place in what seemed like a pretty aggressive fashion.
Yeah.
Because it's comparing to a quality of life. It is. And the other interesting thing, back to the medication that was, the oral testosterone and kind of its role in this. The one thing I did forget to mention that I think is important is that when we talked about removing labels, removing warnings, they don't happen a lot because by the time the ball gets rolling, it's not a brand anymore.
Right.
So there has to be typically some money behind it. So when you're looking at a negative outcome, everybody cares about health, right? So the negatives are going to put on there, there's studies, and that's great. But when it's something like this, who's going to pay for the study, for the Traverse study, to remove a warning label on a quality of life issue if it's not the brand companies? So I know sometimes we knock the drug companies for things like that, but the role that the oral testosterone played in the sense of, let's relook at this because somebody really cares about it and somebody wants this off their label. Is this label valid?
That is in and of itself a fascinating conversation about the money that
dynamic
is used to pay for all these studies has to be recouped somewhere. And if it can't be recouped, then why are we going to pay for it? Therefore, there's a whole lot of research that just isn't going to get done because it's not going to financially benefit anybody.
Exactly. And again, this drug company was motivated by A, we want to get our product approved. Yeah. And then B, we'd rather not have that label on there. Yeah. Which, if it shouldn't be on there, get it off. I mean,
Or they just made it a little more clear. It can increase blood pressure. Yes. Doesn't seem like it's giving everybody heart attacks and strokes,
Altogether, fantastic news. And when the oral medication comes out, I'm sure we'll be talking about that as well, because it's a big deal too. So
it is. Yeah, because the only available routes now are inconvenient. Yeah. It's a topical or injection. So it will be interesting to see with the combination of an oral being approved, and who knows if insurances will approve it, but with it being out there, and then really this conversation restarting. Again, this is from the drug company. I just thought they had some interesting things in there, but looking at, we probably need to shift the conversation from, will testosterone cause cardiovascular issues, to what's the risk of not treating testosterone deficiency, low testosterone, not just quality of life, but for cardiovascular purposes as well.
Yeah. And seems to me that's a legitimate question.
It does.
Low testosterone has so many downstream effects. It seems like that's a pretty big deal.